None of the characters in the book are based on any historical figures, but I think my characters, like those of many authors, are aspects of myself. You take an aspect of yourself that you don't like, or an aspect of yourself that you wish was stronger, an aspect that you don't have that you wish you had, and you project that onto a fictional person and build out of that personality through the creative process. So I think if that's your process, as it is for me, then there's an element of me or an element of each of the characters that I wish was an element of mine throughout the book. But so somebody had sent me a note saying, I think you're Wallace, you must be Wallace. And my response is, well, wow, I wish I was Wallace, because that's the truth. I think he's a terrific person. I'd like to be like him. But I think more generally, in creating the book, this wasn't my intent, but in retrospect, I think one of the strengths of the book is that I like the company of all those people. I mean, I genuinely found the various characters to be entertaining, interesting, compelling, and I like spending time with them. And I think when you're writing a book where you enjoy the company of the characters, it's a huge advantage. You're looking forward to what they're going to do next. I think for me, like many other authors, the characters did surprise me on occasion, and that's of course one of the greatest pleasures of the narrative creative process, is when you've invented an individual and you think you know what they're going to do, but as you're following through the events of the scene, they take actions in a different course than you had anticipated in that moment of writing, sort of busting your outline, as it were. And that's one of the most satisfying aspects of writing. So even though I can say that they've been kind of designed or you've kind of thought them through, if you've done your job well, hopefully what you've done is you've created a spirit that is distinct enough that they'll surprise you while you're writing the book. It's Katie Content, is the way it's pronounced.
Okay, and is that because there is some...
Is there a deep meaning there?
Yeah,
you know what, there isn't a real deep meaning there. It's one of those things, I came up with her name on the first day, and I just sort of never changed it, but I don't really I didn't have a profound strategy for why that would be her name, I must admit. There's many aspects of the book that could have taken place anywhere, but the book belongs in New York City, and it belongs there for a variety of reasons. But certainly, you think about New York City and how it's unusual in the scope of the American landscape or the European cities. It does have some things which are very distinct about it. Certainly, one of them is that New York is unusual in that it is a capital of many of the passions. We think of the city as being a melting pot. New York was a melting pot, it is a melting pot, and when our history teachers describe New York as a melting pot, of course what they tend to mean is that it's a melting pot ethnically, that people from all across Europe in the late 19th century, the early 20th century came to New York, came through Ellis Island, moved into their neighborhoods where their countrymen were gathering and started their great American experiment. And New York, as I say, was and is a melting pot in that way, but it is also a melting pot of the passions. And what I mean by that is that it is a capital of fashion, of finance, of food. It's a capital of the theater, of music, of architecture, of the graphic arts. And the nature of that is when you take a single city and over 100 years, it serves as a capital of all these different human endeavors, is that every year it attracts 25-year-olds from around the country and to some degree from around the world who have arrived to pursue their passion. But because there are so many different fields of endeavor of significance in the city, you're drawing very different people into the city. And if you go out to dinner as a young person, you've come to New York for your own reasons, and you go out with your roommate, and your roommate brings his girlfriend, and she brings her roommate, who brings a buddy of hers from college. As you go around the table, what you end up in this loose assembly is with a wide variety of personalities, people from very different backgrounds, with very different ambitions. And that makes the city sort of unusual, it provides an unusual chemistry to the city. And certainly that's a part of what the book is about, is the fact that a 25-year-old can stumble out into Manhattan, being invited to dinner by chance or going to a gallery and bumping into people, and that spontaneous gathering of new acquaintances that they make can send their lives in very new directions by virtue of that diversity of individuals. So I think that the city, it does play a very unique role kind of in the culture of America, but makes it a very natural setting for this particular tale. The highs and lows of America are in Manhattan to an exaggerated degree, and it's not just the buildings that are taller and the neighborhoods that can be rougher. They're both there, and they coexist very closely. You think about a state like Connecticut. I've spent a lot of time there. It's a terrific state. It's one of the richest states in America per capita, and it has two of the poorest cities in the country. And that distance between a Greenwich, Connecticut and a Bridgeport is vast. The population of Bridgeport, it doesn't really interact with the population of Greenwich, Connecticut. They're living separate lives. That's not true in Manhattan. Those communities live right side by side. Harlem is a short walk really from the Upper East Side, which is one of the most expensive portions of American residential real estate, and those neighborhoods coexist side by side. They ride the subways together, they end up in the movie theaters together, what have you. And so the city can have highs and lows in that sense, meaning that the different social classes are coexisting. But of course, it also has had highs and lows as a city of booms and busts. Again, the cycles of the country economically have come through Manhattan with exaggerated force. And so, yeah, it's a very interesting place in that regard, too. The origin of the book, for those who read the book, I think they can almost anticipate this, which is that in the preface, what it describes is an opening at the Museum of Modern Art in the 1960s. The book is set largely in 1938, but the book opens briefly in the mid-1960s at an opening of the photographs of Walker Evans, which he took on the New York City subways with a hidden camera. And this is a historical event. Walker Evans, the great American photographer, did in fact ride the subways in the late 30s, taking the photographs of whoever was sitting across from him with a camera lens that poked through his shirt. And having taken hundreds of these portraits, in looking at them at the time, he felt he had invaded the privacy of the individuals and he wouldn't show them. And 30 years later, the Museum of Modern Art approached him and said, listen, what about now? Why don't you show them now? So much time has passed. And he agreed to. And I was going through these photographs when I was about 25, and in a catalog of the pictures. And they're quite haunting, because you have this sort of individuals from the 30s sort of looking straight ahead and lost in reflection as they take the subway, assuming that nobody's paying attention to them in that moment. And as I was going through the pictures, I thought, having read in the introduction that they were shown for the first time in the 60s at MoMA, I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if somebody at that opening, which is usually kind of a highfalutin affair, recognized an old acquaintance in one of the portraits. And then as I kept going through the pictures, I thought, even better, what if someone recognized the same friend in two photographs, but the friend had undergone such a transformation that a casual observer wouldn't even realize it was the same person. And that's what I wrote down on a piece of paper, a napkin, whatever. A great idea for a book. Okay, Museum of Modern Art, Walker Evans, two photographs, and you kind of set that aside. And 20 years later, in my mid-40s, when I decided I was going to work on a new project, I go back to my box and I was pulling ideas out of the box. And most of the time when I pull an idea out of that box, I can't read my own writing. So I was lucky in this case in that I saw it and I thought, this is a fun project, and certainly part of the reason revisiting that idea appealed to me is because it would give me the chance to write about a book in New York, write about a book from the 30s, which I find to be such a fascinating environment. 2006, I wrote it over the course of that calendar year, a good year before the mortgage crisis began, or 6 months or something like that, but certainly a good year and a half before the failure of Lehman led to the tumbling of the dominoes that ended up in the financial crisis. And so this book is taking place at the tail end of the Depression, and it's certainly presenting issues of people navigating a time where social positions have changed, where opportunities to recast yourself are different. So it was kind of interesting to have events sort of surface in such a way that suddenly we were talking about a depression or a near depression all over again, and talking about the parallels of of the sort of the carefree behavior of the late 1920s, sort of being mirrored by the carefree behavior that led up, that preceded the financial downturn of 2008, and the uncertainty and destabilization and that followed it. But maybe that's also partly that's an American thing. Yeah, these are extreme events, but if you think of towns, that happens. It not always synced up with 1929 and 2008. If you look at Detroit and the rise and the fall of the cars, or you look at this town, where timber has played a role at one time, and you can get a boom and bust around that cycle, and the lives of all the neighborhoods change, and the aspirations and the families, and so to some degree I think it's an ongoing American reality. One of the pleasures of writing I mentioned a second ago, which is this aspect of discovery, that however carefully you plan a work of fiction, if you're doing it well, if you're in the zone, as it were, it doesn't invent itself, but it brings insight out of you that you weren't conscious of. And it can surprise you in terms of what the individual does, or the themes that surface, the actions that unfold, the insight of the individual characters. And that's a real treat as a creative person, is to have that kind of present itself where you say, oh wow, that's what a great thing that person just said, and you don't really think of it as, oh, that was a great thing I just thought up. I mean, in the best of moments, it's presented to you by the work itself. But I think that to extrapolate from that as an art form, the narrative, what's a little bit unusual about it is the way in which motifs play out over the course of a narrative. In a novel, you can have a very self-conscious motif as you're writing a book, like in my book, photography, an important topic that resurfaces in different contexts over the course of the story for the various characters, and they ideally resonate with each other and create the possibility of reflection or insight for the reader, or ambiguity. And so that's to some degree an intentional motif. But there are unintentional motifs as you're putting together a book, where in retrospect you suddenly realize, oh, this element has played a part in this story in a way that I never intended, or even I didn't even notice over the course of telling the story. I think a good example in this particular book for me is that when it was all said and done, and I had been editing it for a while, really in the final stages of editing before publication, I suddenly realized that shipwrecks play a major role throughout the story in surprising elements. There's Katie, the main character, stumbles across a photograph of Shackleton with his shipwreck in the polar area. She and Tinker find themselves discussing Robinson Crusoe, shipwrecked on an island, and asking them what would they bring to an island if they found themselves like Robinson Crusoe. The Titanic is mentioned on various occasions. And Thoreau ends up playing a significant thematic role in the story, and almost all the passages that come to the surface about Thoreau are actually about navigation. How does one find the pole star to figure out where they should go in their lives? But he's drawing that from a navigational notion, looking at the North Star to set your course. And so, as I say, suddenly in retrospect you see, oh wow, that's amazing that at some unconscious level that must have been on my mind, even though it was never something that is drawn out in detail in the book. And that's a great pleasure, as a writer, when you see that your subconscious is working overtime in compelling ways. When I finish this project, I'm not writing a sequel per se. My next novel is going to be set in a different place at a different time, and that's part of the excitement of being a writer, is you can do that. But when I finished the book, one of the sort of the loose ends that really intrigued me was where Eve, the character Eve, was going. At the end of the book, she ends up on a train, headed off to California, to Hollywood, kind of as a surprise. And that's one of the cases where she surprised me. As I was writing the section where she was on the train, I was assuming she was going to see her family in Chicago, and suddenly she just didn't get off the train. And so as I finished the manuscript, I really thought, I wonder what she's doing in Hollywood. I really like her. I think it'd be fascinating to know. And so I'm writing right now an extended short story that follows Eve to Hollywood, and anybody who sends me their email address to amortowles.com, I'll send them the short story. But so I'll do that, and then I'll move on to, as I say, a totally new project. You asked of the 1970s detective shows, which I'm a fan of, who did I most align myself with? And I said that I wish I was Rockford. I think he's really dashing and sharp and everything else, and I love his con man background. But I'm probably more like Columbo, which is in a little bit dirty raincoat, taking a long time to get around to my point. But that's probably why.